So let's just go ahead and bring on our guest, Gordon G. Chang, talk a little bit about what's happening with China. He is most recently the author of Losing South Korea, a booklet released by Encounter Books in March of 2009. Before that, he published the book Nuclear Showdown, North Korea Takes on the World, and The Coming Collapse of China. And right now, here's what's going on regarding China. They are accusing the United States government and U.S. Army of creating this virus and putting it out into Wuhan, basically generating it here, when we know that it started in Wuhan, China. This is quite something. Gordon Chang is a great guy to talk to about issues related to China, North Korea, and more, and I'm pleased to welcome him to Jimmy at the Crossroads. Gordon, how you doing?
I'm fine, Jimmy, and thank you so much.
I'm going to ask my producers to please turn up the volume for the computer here. I can't really hear Gordon all that well. Gordon, thanks so much for taking the time. I really appreciate you joining us. So, bottom line, what's your take on what's happening with regards to China in particular at this moment?
Well, this is scary, dangerous, Jimmy. What we have is the Chinese Foreign Ministry, since about the end of the first week in February, really on a determined campaign to tar the United States with responsibility for various viruses, including H1N1 and now the coronavirus. Because as you point out, on Thursday, a foreign ministry spokesman, this is an official tweet, by the way, said that patient zero was an American and that the U.S. Army brought the virus to Wuhan. On Friday, the following day, we called in the Chinese ambassador to complain about this malicious disinformation campaign. And this week, China's ambassador to South Africa has continued to tweet out this theory. And so clearly China's not being deterred by what's going on. What is going on, I think, is that Beijing's leaders are trying to justify for in their own mind the use of force against the U.S. They're trying to prepare the Chinese people for this. I'm not saying that they're going to attack us, but all the elements in place for a really horrible situation are there. And so we've got to be concerned about Beijing's doing.
About this, what do you make of how the Chinese have handled this from the start?
It's really been horrible. We know that the first patient was diagnosed with the coronavirus on December 8th, according to the World Health Organization. But we also have got indications that Chinese authorities knew about this, knew about something in November. Xi Jinping, the Chinese ruler, actually made the first public acknowledgement on a wide-scale basis on January 20, which means that there was at least 6 weeks while this virus spread around China and indeed escaped China to the rest of the world. We know that on January 19th, the authorities in Wuhan held a potluck dinner for something like 40,000 families. And if you were trying to think of a way to spread virus, that's the way that you would do it. So this is just, the Communist Party understands how exposed it is because the Chinese people right now are white-hot angry and are demanding fundamental political change.
Do you think that the political situation in China right now, Gordon Chang, is the reason why the Chinese are trying to blame the United States? Because that would seem like the obvious justification.
Yes, it is. And because they are so exposed, the measures that they could take against us, according to their narrative, are extreme. And that's why we've got to be concerned about what they're doing. But, you know, as I mentioned, we don't seem to be deterring them with normal means. So we've got to figure out to impose even greater costs on China. And that, I think, should be, for instance, closing down one or more of their consulates, expelling their diplomats. We've got to do something that makes a statement to show that the United States is taking this as seriously as we should.
One of the things that we've noticed about China is that they have been very much expanding their influence around the globe, especially with economic initiatives like the Belt and Road and so forth. So I would think that this propaganda effort to blame the United States and specifically the U.S. Army for this Wuhan-started virus, this coronavirus COVID-19, might not just be about the Chinese people, although maybe primarily, but also other parts of the world that may be susceptible to Chinese propaganda influence.
That's a really important point that you made, because we know, or at least we have indications, that people around the world are actually buying into China's line. So this is not just some ludicrous propaganda. We Americans will just sort of dismiss it, saying, "Oh, that's ridiculous. How could anyone believe it?" But people either believe it or they will accept the line because they believe it's in their interest to do so. So the United States is at risk here.
So, Gordon, when it comes to this Chinese policy, or what we're seeing right now with China, of course, this comes in the wake of the trade war agreement number one, the phase one deal between the United States and China. What did you make of that deal, and how did that set up for what would unfold now in 2020 with regards to coronavirus?
Yeah, I didn't like the phase one deal from a number of different perspectives, Jimmy. But right now, Global Times, which is controlled by People's Daily, which is the most authoritative publication in China, it's the voice of China. Global Times has been dropping hints for a couple weeks now that China should not be held to its obligations under the phase one deal, specifically to buy an additional $200 billion worth of U.S. goods and services over the next 2 years, considering a 2017 base. This is the heart of the agreement for the United States. And, a lot of people are going to say, well, how can you force China to honor its obligations when they've gone through this epidemic? But we got to remember that the Chinese leaders knew about the severity of the coronavirus outbreak when they signed this deal on the 15th of January. And to make this matter worse, the Chinese sent their delegation into the East Room of the White House to meet the American leadership, many American figures in media and the rest of it. And each of those Chinese delegation members was a potential disease carrier. So this is just abominable behavior on the part of Beijing. And if the Chinese don't want to honor the phase one deal, fine with me. We should just raise our Section 301 tariffs. Remember, those tariffs were meant to stop China stealing our intellectual property. There's no indication that they've stopped trying to do that. So putting on more tariffs on the Chinese is exactly the right thing to do.
Again, we're talking with Gordon Chang, author of the book, The Coming Collapse of China. And Gordon, when we look at the tariff situation, though, this is one area where you and I disagree. Even now, there's an interesting piece in the Wall Street Journal yesterday. Trump's tariffs leave the U.S. short on vital medical supplies, by Robert Zoellick, pointing out that there are tariffs on some of these things, like ventilators and so forth, that are coming in from China. Now, at this moment, of course, the president's working to ramp up production, perhaps invoking the Defense Production Act yesterday, at least saying that he's laying the groundwork for that. But in the meantime, even if you're trying to ramp that up, we need more of those masks and ventilators. And if you're raising the cost to bring them into the United States, it makes it more difficult to do so. Why raise tariffs higher at this point?
Well, because the Chinese are not keeping up their end of a deal. They probably had no intention of honoring their deal when they signed it. Tariffs are tariffs. We'll just pay a little bit more for stuff. We can do that. And Robert Zoellick has absolutely no credibility. His sort of engagement theory, let's engage the Chinese there. We want them to be a responsible stakeholder. That comes from his famous 2005 speech. He obviously doesn't understand what's going on in China. He's been consistently wrong about China. So, from every perspective, we need to start defending ourselves. I'm not saying it's going to be cost-free. Obviously, it's not going to be cost-free. But the Chinese are leaving us no choice because they're just, last week they accused us of germ warfare. So I don't know how you get to a more dangerous situation without actually starting a war. But the Chinese are very close to doing that because they have laid out basically a crime against humanity. They charged us with that and with germ warfare. So what more can we look at and say, oh, let's try to cooperate with these guys? Can't do that.
Let's go back to the propaganda effort for a moment with you, Gordon Chang, because I'm wondering how effective it actually is. We have seen what's been going on in Hong Kong. Now, of course, that's not part of mainland China, so to speak, but nevertheless, that unrest is something that the people of mainland China have been aware of. Of course, there have been economic concerns in China already prior to this point here because of the trade war and other factors going on internally. So the question in my mind is, how much of an influence does the Chinese government have with these propaganda efforts on the people in China and their mindset about what's the cause of coronavirus, COVID-19, and so forth, as well as the propaganda effort in other countries around the globe?
Well, China's a big place. I mean, they claim 1.4 billion people, maybe 1.3, but it's a big place. You can find people who buy into China's line. And, you know, China actually employs a lot of Chinese people, the 50-cent army, as it's called. So it does find support there. I think most Chinese people probably are not going to buy this because, you know, we saw, so for instance, in beginning of last month, basically people starting to say, look, we need to have freedom of speech. We need to have a new political system. They adopted Do You Hear the People Sing as their anthem, which is that politically impactful song from Les Miserables, which is what the people in Hong Kong did as a political protest. So, yeah, I think that most Chinese people probably don't accept it. But, you know, you can't operate on the notion that their propaganda is so ludicrous that we can just slough it off, because obviously they think it's effective. We do have some evidence that people are buying it. And this is dangerous because they are saying that we have engaged in the most horrible conduct in the world, short of the use of force against the Chinese people. This is inflaming the situation.
Again, Gordon Chang, our guest. There's a couple quick final things. I want to try to play that cut we were doing before of cut 4, where President Trump was asked about any potential consequences for China. Take a listen to this.
Big difference.
Are you thinking about any types of repercussions for China, and are you also rethinking sort of the supply lines for our manufacturing industry?
I don't want to comment on that right now.
So the president didn't want to comment on that question, which is somewhat unusual, but I'm wondering, does he have something sort of up his sleeve or something that they're working on in the U.S. government as far as actual retaliation, and he just doesn't want to give any indications or tip his hand at all?
Yeah, I'm not in the president's mind. I don't know. I am sure that he, as almost any president would be, reluctant to impose severe costs on China, especially at a sensitive time like this. But the Chinese just are not leaving him very much choice, because they're pushing and pushing and pushing the United States. And they're pushing in very dangerous ways. And so it seems to me that the president has now a responsibility to push back, to defend ourselves. He's done a great job in terms of sort of setting the way and setting the path for what we need to do, but we need to do a lot more, because Beijing obviously is not being deterred by normal means. You know, as I said, we launched that protest with the Chinese ambassador on Friday, and yet the Chinese are persisting in this malicious campaign against us.
I'm also curious your thoughts on the controversy surrounding President Trump's use of Chinese virus. We have cut 3 here. This is the president yesterday, where he was explaining why he's decided to continue using that term instead of just coronavirus. Take a listen to this.
Why do you keep calling this the Chinese virus? There are reports of dozens of incidents of bias against Chinese Americans in this country. Your own aide, Secretary Azar, says he does not use this term. He says ethnicity does not cause the virus. Why do you keep using this? A lot of people say it's racist.
It's not racist at all. No, not at all. It comes from China. That's why. It comes from China. I want to be accurate.
About Chinese
Yeah,
Americans
please,
in
John.
this country.
Please.
The aides behind you. Are you comfortable with this term?
I have great love for all of the people from our country, but as you know, China tried to say at one point, maybe they stopped now, that it was caused by American soldiers. That can't happen. It's not going to happen. Not as long as I'm president. It comes from China. John, please.
Inflaming racial tensions or calling a spade, Gordon Chang. What do you make of the idea that the President of the United States keeps calling COVID-19 the Chinese virus?
I would encourage him to continue to do so. I'm Chinese American. I don't find it racist at all. You have to put that into the context of the Foreign Ministry's campaign against the U.S., including the statements on Thursday, which I think, as I said, are exceedingly dangerous. President of the United States, the Secretary of State, and the Vice President as well have been talking about various formulations of Chinese virus or Wuhan virus. And it's important to do so, to tell the United States and to tell the people of the world and to tell the Chinese that the United States did not spread this to China. So I think that we got to support the president. And I think that people in the media need to understand that we now have a common enemy. That common enemy means us harm. That common enemy is doing extremely dangerous things. And we need to support our president in the defense of our republic, because we are at risk. This is an existential fight, and we need to defend ourselves at this moment. I think it's terrific what President Trump is doing.
Final question for you, Gordon Chang, before we let you go, and appreciate your time today. Where do you think this may head? I mean, if you can project out based on some of the signals that the president has given, do we get tougher, or is it more like in a public fashion, or is it more behind the scenes? How do you think it might play out? Of course, not knowing for sure, but just curious your thoughts on what might take place.
Jimmy, anything can take place. You can't rule anything out. Even in good times, you have People's Daily carry an article, as it did last May, declaring a quote-unquote people's war on the U.S. We go back to 2018. China was lasering our planes, trying to blind our pilots, actually successfully in one instance. And you have to say that's an attempt to bring down the plane. They used sonic attacks to cause brain injuries to our diplomats in Guangzhou. They have no reluctance in harming Americans. So this could actually end up in a war. Who knows? I don't think it will, but nonetheless, we have to make sure that we understand that perhaps history's next great war is in the cards. And it's not because of what the United States is doing, it's because of what China is doing. American people need to understand that, so do the Chinese people. We have no choice but to defend ourselves.
Gordon Chang, I'm sure we will have many more conversations to come on Jimmy at the Crossroads with you, where we will agree, disagree, we'll see how it goes. But, my friend, it's always good to talk with you. It's been a while, so I'm glad to do so again. Thanks for taking the time.
Oh, well, thank you so much, Jimmy. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Thank you. I do as well. All right, once again, Gordon Chang, author of the book, The Coming Collapse of China, joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. All right, we're going to shift gears.